The clipboard slammed against my kitchen table, so hard I thought the 40-year-old would might crack. And standing in my doorway was a woman with a haircut that screamed, "I need to speak to your manager," and an expression that told me my peaceful morning was about to get a whole lot more complicated. Are you aware that your chickens are in direct violation of Section 7, Paragraph 4 of the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association bylaws? She demanded, her perfectly manicured finger jabbing toward my backyard, where my 6 hens were happily scratching around in the dirt. I looked at her, still holding my morning coffee, trying to process what was happening. "I'm sorry, who are you?" Susan Patterson, president of the Meadowbrook Hills HOA. She said it like she was announcing herself as the Queen of England. "And those chickens need to go. Immediately." I took a slow sip of my coffee, buying myself time to think. This was going to be interesting. "Madam, I don't know what Meadowbrook Hills is, but I can tell you right now, those chickens aren't going anywhere." Her face turned a shade of red that probably wasn't healthy. "Excuse me. Did you not receive our certified letter?" "I don't receive letters from your HOA because I'm not part of your HOA." I stepped out onto my porch, gesturing to the sprawling property around us. "This is the Novak family farm, has been since 1982, long before any suburb existed out here." Susan's eyes narrowed. "That's impossible. All properties in this area are part of Meadowbrook Hills. The entire development was established in 2019 and every home is bound by our covenants." I couldn't help but laugh. "Your development, sure, but my farm. My dad bought this land 43 years ago, 20 acres of it. We've been here raising chickens, growing vegetables, and minding our own business ever since." 20 acres. Susan looked genuinely shocked, her clipboard dropping slightly. "That can't be right. The lots in this area are half an acre each." "My lot isn't half an acre. My property extends from County Road 47 all the way back to Miller's Creek. Your suburb was built around me, not over me." I finished my coffee and set the mug on the porch railing. "So like I said, the chickens stay." Susan's expression hardened again. "We'll see about that. I'll be contacting the county about this." "You do that." I watched her march back down my driveway, her heels clicking against the gravel. This wasn't going to be the end of it. I could feel it. "My name is Brandon Novak, and at 38 years old, I'd seen enough to know when trouble was brewing. I'd taken over the farm when my dad passed away 3 years ago, keeping his dream alive even as the world changed around me. Dad had always warned me that eventually the developers would come sniffing around. He just hadn't lived long enough to see them actually arrive. The farm wasn't huge by agricultural standards, but it was substantial enough that selling wasn't something I'd ever considered. 20 acres of prime Pennsylvania land just outside Reading, with good soil, good water, and enough space to keep a small flock of chickens, grow seasonal vegetables, and maintain a small orchard. I sold eggs and produce at the local farmers market every weekend, and it gave me a simple, honest living. The suburb that had sprung up around me over the past 6 years was something else entirely. Meadowbrook Hills. I'd watched the construction crews arrive, heard the chainsaws and bulldozers, seen the identical houses pop up like mushrooms after rain. McMansions, my dad would have called them. Big houses on tiny lots, all painted in approved neutral tones with approved landscaping and approved mailboxes. I'd never paid much attention to them. They stayed on their side of the property line and I stayed on mine. At least, that's how it had been until today. The next morning I was out feeding the chickens when I heard a car pull up. Then another. Then another. I walked around to the front of my farmhouse to find 3 vehicles parked in my driveway. Susan emerged from one, along with 2 other women who looked like they'd been cut from the same cloth. "Mr. Novak," Susan called out in a voice that was trying to sound pleasant but came across as condescending. "I'd like to introduce you to the HOA board. This is Patricia Henderson, our vice president, and Margaret Williams, our treasurer." Patricia was a tall woman with designer sunglasses perched on her head. Margaret looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. Both of them smiled at me with the kind of fake warmth that made my skin crawl. "Ladies," I said, not moving from my spot, "what can I do for you?" "We've done some research," Susan said, pulling out what looked like a property survey. "And while it's true that your property predates our development, we believe there may have been an error in the original planning. The county shows that a portion of your eastern boundary actually encroaches on HOA property." I crossed my arms. "Is that right?" "Yes. Specifically, the area where you keep your chickens." Susan's smile was triumphant. "We'd like to arrange for a new survey to be conducted." "At your expense, naturally." "Naturally." I held out my hand. "Can I see that survey?" She handed it over, and I studied it carefully. The document looked official enough, but something was off. The measurements didn't match what I knew about my property. My dad had been meticulous about boundaries, and I had all his original paperwork filed away in the farmhouse. "This is interesting," I said slowly, "because according to the county records I have, my eastern boundary is marked by that line of oak trees, which are clearly on my property. The same oak trees that were here when this land was surveyed in 1981. Patricia stepped forward. "Records can be outdated, Mr. Novak. The county has updated their mapping systems significantly since then." "I'll tell you what," I said, handing the survey back to Susan. "Why don't we all go down to the county assessor's office together? We can pull up the original deed, the survey maps, and settle this once and for all." The three women exchanged glances. Susan's jaw tightened. "That won't be necessary. We have legal counsel reviewing the matter." "Good, so do I." I didn't, not yet, but I would by the end of the day. "Have your lawyer contact mine. Until then, stay off my property." Margaret actually looked embarrassed as they left, but Susan and Patricia maintained their icy composure. I watched them drive away, then pulled out my phone and called the one person I knew could help me. Jake Morrison had been my best friend since high school. He'd gone on to become a real estate attorney, handling property disputes across eastern Pennsylvania. If anyone could help me navigate this mess, it was him. "Brandon, my man." Jake's cheerful voice came through the phone. "What's going on?" I explained the situation, and I could hear him typing on his computer as I talked. "Okay, so let me get this straight," Jake said when I finished. "An HOA that was established in 2019 is trying to claim that your farm, which has been there since 1982, is somehow subject to their rules. That's about the size of it." Jake laughed. "That's the dumbest thing I've heard all week, and I work in real estate law. Look, pull together all your property documents. Original deed, survey maps, tax records, everything. I'll meet you tomorrow morning and we'll head down to the county office together." "Thanks, Jake. I appreciate it. Don't mention it." This should be pretty cut and dry, but HOAs can be persistent. Better to nip it in the bud now. I spent the rest of the day going through my dad's files. He'd kept everything organized in a series of filing cabinets in what used to be the farm office. Original deed from 1982. Survey maps. Property tax records going back decades. Letters from the county about zoning changes. Correspondence with neighbors about boundary agreements. Photos of the land before and during development. The more I looked through the documents, the more confident I felt. Everything was crystal clear. The farm had been here first, and no HOA could change that. But that night, lying in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The next few days proved me right. First, It was a citation from the county about unauthorized agricultural activities in a residential zone. Jake helped me fight that one by pointing out that my property was grandfathered in under agricultural zoning long before the residential development arrived. Then, it was a complaint to animal control about noise violations. The inspector who came out was actually pretty cool about it. He listened to my chickens for about 5 minutes, checked their coop conditions, and then told me he'd grown up on a farm and wished more people understood how quiet chickens actually were compared to dogs. "For what it's worth," he said as he filled out his report, "you've got a nice setup here. Clean, well-maintained, good space for the birds. Whoever called this in is wasting everyone's time." "Let me guess," I said. "Susan Patterson." He smiled but didn't answer. He didn't have to. The following Monday, Jake and I met at the county assessor's office in Reading. It was an old brick building that had been there since the 1950s, with that distinctive government building smell of old paper and floor polish. The clerk who helped us was a woman in her 60s named Dorothy, who'd worked there for 35 years. When I explained what we needed, her face lit up. "Oh, you're the Novak farm. I remember when your father bought that property. Lovely man, always paid his taxes on time." She disappeared into the back room and emerged 15 minutes later with a thick folder. "Here we go. Original deed, survey maps, and all subsequent documentation." We spread everything out on one of the research tables, and Dorothy walked us through it. The boundaries were clear and had never changed. The 20 acres were exactly where they'd always been, with the eastern boundary running along that line of oak trees. "Now," Dorothy said, pushing her glasses up her nose, "I can tell you that when the Meadowbrook Hills development was approved, the county was very careful about the boundaries. The developer was required to survey all adjacent properties and ensure no encroachment. The Novak farm was specifically noted in the planning documents as an existing agricultural property that was to remain independent." Jake was taking notes, a smile growing on his face. "Can we get certified copies of all of this?" "Absolutely. Give me about 20 minutes. While we waited, a commotion at the front desk caught our attention. Susan Patterson had arrived and she was not happy to see us. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, marching over to our table. "Same thing you probably are," I said calmly. "Looking at property records. Those are private documents." Dorothy, who had returned with our copies, raised an eyebrow. "Actually, madam, property records are public documents. Anyone can request them." Susan's face flushed. "I need to see the records for the Meadowbrook Hills development boundaries." "Certainly. I'll need to see your identification and you'll need to fill out a request form." While Susan dealt with the paperwork, Jake and I reviewed the certified copies Dorothy had prepared. Everything was perfect. Every document confirmed what I already knew. My farm was my farm, period. "Oh, one more thing," Dorothy said quietly, leaning closer to us. "Off the record. I've had 3 different HOA board members in here over the past week, all trying to find something that would give them jurisdiction over the Novak property. They're not going to find it, but I thought you should know they're trying hard." "Thanks for the heads up," I said. As Jake and I left, I saw Susan still at the desk, arguing with Dorothy about something. This was escalating, and I had a feeling it was going to get worse before it got better. That weekend at the farmer's market, I started hearing stories. Other vendors who lived in or near Meadowbrook Hills told me about HOA harassment, fines for having the wrong color mailbox, citations for grass being a 1/4 inch too long, demands to remove garden decorations that were perfectly reasonable but not aesthetically consistent with community standards. "They tried to make me remove my flagpole," one guy told me. He was a veteran who sold honey from his backyard hives. said it was too tall. I had to get a lawyer involved and show them the freedom to display the American Flag Act. Cost me $3,000 in legal fees just to keep my flag up. Another woman who sold homemade jams told me the HOA had tried to shut down her home business, claiming it violated residential use policies. Never mind that I've been making jam in my kitchen for 20 years. They said the delivery trucks were a nuisance. I got one delivery a month from the bottle supplier. The more I heard, the angrier I got. These people were bullies, plain and simple. They got a little bit of power and used it to make other people's lives miserable. On Sunday afternoon, I got home from the market to find a letter taped to my front door. It was from the Meadowbrook Hills HOA, informing me that I was in violation of their bylaws and would be subject to daily fines of $500 until I removed the chickens and brought the property into compliance. I called Jake immediately. "They can't do that," he said after I read him the letter. "You're not part of their HOA. They have no authority to fine you." "So what do I do?" "Write them a response. Keep it professional but firm. State clearly that you are not subject to their authority and any attempt to collect fines will be considered harassment." "I'll draft something up and email it to you tonight." The letter Jake sent was perfect. Professional, clear, and backed up with legal citations. I printed it out, signed it, and hand-delivered it to Susan's house the next morning. She answered the door in yoga pants and a tank top, clearly not expecting visitors. When she saw me, her expression hardened. "Mr. Novak, what do you want?" I handed her the envelope. "Response to your letter. You might want to read it carefully, particularly the part about harassment." She tore open the envelope right there and scanned the contents. I watched her face go through several shades of red. "Is that a threat?" "It's a legal notice. There's a difference." I turned to leave, then paused. "Susan, I'm not trying to be difficult. I just want to live my life and run my farm in peace. You want to run your HOA, fine, but leave me out of it." "This isn't over," she said. I didn't think it would be. 2 days later, I woke up to find construction equipment blocking my driveway. A crew was installing a fence right along what Susan claimed was the HOA property boundary, which conveniently cut off access to my chicken coop. I called the county code enforcement office and explained what was happening. Then I called Jake. Then I called the police non-emergency line. The county inspector arrived first. He took one look at the fence installation, checked the property records on his tablet, and immediately ordered the crew to stop work. "This fence is being installed on private property without the owner's permission," he told the confused foreman. "You need to cease all work immediately." "We've got a permit," the foreman said, showing him paperwork. The inspector studied it. "This permit was issued based on false property information. I'm revoking it effective immediately." He turned to me. "Mr. Novak, do you want to press charges for trespassing?" I looked at the partially installed fence, thinking. Not against the crew, they were just doing their job, but whoever ordered this knew exactly what they were doing. A patrol car pulled up and Officer David Martinez stepped out. I'd gone to school with his younger brother and knew the family. He assessed the situation, talked to the inspector, and then asked me what I wanted to do. "The HOA president, Susan Patterson, ordered this work," I said. "She knew it was on my property. She's been harassing me for weeks about my chickens." Officer Martinez took notes. "I can't arrest her for this, but I can go talk to her about the situation. Make it clear that any further trespassing will result in charges." "That would be appreciated." The fence crew packed up and left, taking their partial fence with them. The county inspector gave me his card and told me to call him directly if there were any further issues. Officer Martinez headed to Susan's house. I spent the afternoon repairing the damage to my yard where the fence posts had been started. My neighbor from the actual neighboring farm, an older guy named Tom who'd known my dad, came over to help. "That HOA woman is something else," he said, pulling out a fence post. "She came by my place last month, wanted me to trim my trees because they were visually disruptive to the neighborhood. I told her my trees were planted in 1965 and would be here long after she was gone." "Did she leave you alone after that?" Tom chuckled. "For now. But I've been documenting everything, just in case. You should do the same." It was good advice. That evening, I started a detailed log of every interaction with the HOA, including dates, times, and what was said or done. I took photos of my property boundaries, my chickens, and the condition of my land. I saved every letter, every email, every piece of correspondence. Jake had warned me that HOA disputes could drag on for months or even years. I was preparing for the long haul. But then things took a turn I hadn't expected. I was at the feed store the following week, loading bags of chicken feed into my truck when a woman approached me. She was younger than Susan, maybe early 30s, and looked nervous. "Are you Brandon Novak?" she asked. "That's me. I'm Rachel Foster. I live in Meadowbrook Hills. Can I talk to you for a minute?" We sat in my truck with the air conditioning running, and Rachel told me her story. She and her husband had bought a house in the development 2 years ago. At first, everything seemed fine. Then the HOA board started sending them violations. Their grass was too long. Their Halloween decorations were up too early. Their car was parked facing the wrong direction in their driveway. "Every violation comes with a fine," Rachel said. "We've paid over $8,000 in the past year. We can't sell the house because we can't afford to pay off the fines, and they keep adding more." "That's insane. Have you talked to a lawyer?" "We can't afford one, not with all these fines." She pulled out her phone and showed me photos of her violations. The grass looked perfectly normal. The Halloween decorations were tasteful. The car was just a car, parked in a driveway. "Rachel, these are bogus. They're making up violations to collect money." "I know, but what can we do? The HOA bylaws say we have to pay the fines or face a lien on our property." I thought for a moment. "How many other people in your neighborhood are dealing with this?" "Almost everyone. There's a private Facebook group where people share their violations. Last count, there were about 40 families being actively fined. An idea was forming in my head. Can you get me access to that group?" Rachel hesitated. "If Susan finds out I'm talking to you, she'll make my life even worse." "She won't find out from me, but Rachel, this isn't right. What they're doing sounds illegal. If we can document it, we might be able to stop them." She chewed her lip, thinking, then she nodded. "Okay. I'll add you to the group. But please be careful. Susan is vindictive." That night, I joined the Meadowbrook Hills Victim Support Group. The name alone told me everything I needed to know. The posts were heartbreaking. People being fined hundreds of dollars for minor infractions. Families going into debt trying to comply with constantly changing rules. Some people talking about foreclosure because they couldn't keep up with the HOA fees and fines. I screenshot everything and sent it to Jake. His response came 30 minutes later. "This is absolutely not legal. Call me tomorrow. We need to talk." The next morning, I met Jake at a coffee shop in Reading. He brought another lawyer with him, a woman named Sarah Chen who specialized in HOA law. "I've reviewed what you sent me," Sarah said, stirring her coffee. "What this HOA is doing is textbook abuse. They're using selective enforcement to generate revenue. In Pennsylvania, HOAs are allowed to fine residents for legitimate violations, but the fines have to be reasonable and the violations have to be real." "What can we do?" I asked. "We can file a class action lawsuit on behalf of all the affected homeowners," Jake said, "but we'd need people willing to come forward and testify." "I think I can make that happen," I said. "But there's another problem. A lot of these people can't afford legal fees." Sarah smiled. "That's why class action suits exist. We take the case on contingency. If we win, we collect fees from the HOA. If we lose, the plaintiffs don't pay anything." "How long would something like this take?" "Months, probably. Maybe a year. But in the meantime, we can file for an injunction to stop them from collecting any new fines while the case is pending." I thought about Rachel and all the other families being squeezed by this predatory HOA. Let's do it. Over the next 2 weeks, I became an unlikely community organizer. Working with Rachel and a few other brave residents, we set up a meeting at a neutral location, a community center in Reading that was outside the HOA's jurisdiction. 43 families showed up. The room was packed with angry, frustrated people who'd been pushed to their breaking point. Jake and Sarah explained the legal situation, answered questions, and collected documentation from everyone who wanted to join the suit. By the end of the meeting, 38 families had signed on as plaintiffs. "This is going to get messy," Jake warned me as we left. "HOAs don't like being challenged, and from what I've seen, this board is particularly aggressive." He was right. 2 days after word of the lawsuit leaked, Susan showed up at my farm again. This time, she brought the police with her. Officer Martinez stepped out of his patrol car looking uncomfortable. "Brandon, I'm sorry about this, but I have to respond to the call." "What call?" Susan stepped forward. "I've reported you for animal cruelty. Those chickens are being kept in inhumane conditions." I stared at her, genuinely shocked. "You've got to be kidding me." "I'm well within my rights to report suspected animal abuse." Officer Martinez sighed. "Brandon, I need to take a look at the chickens. It's just procedure." "Fine, come on." We walked around to the backyard where my 6 hens were happily pecking around their large, clean coop. They had fresh water, plenty of food, shade, and about 200 square feet of space to roam. They were probably better housed than half the people in Pennsylvania. Officer Martinez spent about 30 seconds looking at the setup before turning to Susan. "Madam, these animals are clearly well cared for. There's no violation here. But look at the size of that coop. It's far too small." "Madam, I grew up on a farm. This coop could handle twice as many birds comfortably. Mr. Novak is actually exceeding recommended space requirements." Susan's face was turning that familiar shade of red. "This is ridiculous. I want to file a formal complaint." "You can do that at the station, but I'm not writing up any violations here." Officer Martinez turned to me. "Sorry for the hassle, Brandon. Not your fault." After they left, I sat on my porch steps and tried to calm down. This was getting out of control. Susan wasn't just being a nuisance anymore. She was actively trying to destroy my life. That night, I got a call from Rachel. "Brandon, you need to know what's happening. Susan called an emergency HOA meeting. She's telling people that you're the reason their property values are dropping. She's trying to turn the whole neighborhood against you. Let her try. Anyone with half a brain can see what's really going on. I hope you're right. But be careful. I heard her telling Patricia that they need to take more aggressive action." I didn't like the sound of that. "Rachel, if you see or hear anything specific, call me right away and call the police if necessary." "I will. And Brandon, thank you for helping us. A lot of people here are grateful, even if they're too scared to say it." The aggressive action came 3 days later at 2 in the morning. I woke up to the sound of my chickens going crazy, squawking and carrying on in a way they never did at night. I grabbed a flashlight and ran outside in my pajamas. Someone had cut through the chicken wire on the coop. My 6 hens were scattered around the yard in a panic, and I could see a figure running toward the tree line. "Hey!" I shouted, chasing after them. but whoever it was disappeared into the darkness before I could get close. I spent the next hour rounding up my chickens. Fortunately, all 6 were okay, just scared. I got them secured in my garage for the night and inspected the damage to the coop. The wire had been cut cleanly with tools, not torn. This was deliberate vandalism. I called the police. Officer Martinez couldn't come, but another officer, a woman named Officer Thompson, arrived about 20 minutes later. I showed her the damage and explained what had happened. "Any idea who might have done this?" she asked. "I've got a pretty good guess." I told her about the HOA situation, the lawsuit, and Susan's escalating harassment. "But you didn't see who did it?" "No, it was too dark, and they ran before I could get close." Officer Thompson took photos and filed a report. "I'll make sure patrol keeps an eye on your property." "And Mr. Novak, you might want to consider installing security cameras. I'm calling someone first thing in the morning." By noon the next day, I had a security company installing cameras covering every angle of my property. It wasn't cheap, but it was necessary. Jake also suggested I document the vandalism as part of our legal case. "This shows a pattern of harassment," he said. "It strengthens our position." The lawsuit was officially filed a week later. 38 families versus the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association, alleging abuse of authority, selective enforcement, and harassment. The local news picked up the story, and suddenly, my quiet little farm was getting more attention than I'd ever wanted. A reporter from the Reading Eagle came out to interview me. I showed her my property, explained the history, and told her about the chickens that had started the whole mess. "This seems like a pretty simple case," she said, taking notes. "Your farm was here first." "Why is the HOA so determined to force you out?" "Control," I said. "They want everything in their little world to be exactly the way they think it should be. A working farm doesn't fit their vision." The article ran on the front page of the local section, complete with photos of my farmhouse and chickens. The headline read, "Local farm faces HOA pressure despite predating development. Public opinion was firmly on my side." The newspaper's online comments section was full of people supporting me and criticizing the HOA. Even the mayor of Reading gave a statement saying that historic agricultural properties needed to be protected. But Susan wasn't backing down. She gave her own interview to a different news outlet, claiming that my farm was a nuisance, lowered property values, and created health hazards. "Chickens attract rodents and disease," she said on camera. "This is a residential neighborhood now, and agricultural activities are inappropriate." The health department actually showed up to investigate her claims. The inspector who came out was thorough, checking every inch of my property for rodents, contamination, or health hazards. He found nothing. "Your property is actually cleaner than most residential homes I inspect," he told me. "No violations whatsoever. Whoever called this in was wasting our time." More documentation for the lawsuit. Jake and Sarah were building a comprehensive case, and every false accusation, every bogus complaint, every act of harassment added to it. The injunction hearing was scheduled for late September, about 6 weeks after the lawsuit was filed. In the meantime, life in Meadowbrook Hills was getting tense. The HOA had stopped collecting most fines, probably on advice from their lawyer, but Susan and her board were still finding ways to make life difficult for anyone they suspected of being part of the lawsuit. Rachel called me regularly with updates. "They've started doing property inspections," she said. "Walking around with clipboards, taking photos, making notes. It's creepy." "Are they trespassing on people's property?" "Sometimes. They claim they have the right to inspect common areas and make sure no one is violating bylaws." "Tell people to document everything. Photos, videos, dates, times, all of it. The tension finally broke at the injunction hearing. The courtroom was packed with residents from Meadowbrook Hills, most of them supporting the lawsuit. Susan sat at the defendant's table with 3 lawyers in expensive suits. Judge Patricia Hartley was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd been on the bench for over 20 years. She listened to opening arguments from both sides, reviewed the documentation, and then started asking questions. "Miss Patterson," she said, looking at Susan over her glasses, "can you explain why the HOA is charging Mr. Foster here $500 for having his grass at 3 inches when your bylaws state the maximum is 3.5 inches? Susan stood up. "The grass was measured incorrectly by Mr. Foster. Our inspector found it to be 4 inches. And you have documentation of this measurement." The inspector's notes, "Yes. I see." "And the inspector measured the grass at multiple points throughout the yard." Susan hesitated. "I would have to check the specific documentation." Judge Hartley moved on to another case. "Mrs. Chen, you were fined $300 for having a garden gnome in your front yard. The violation notice says the gnome is not aesthetically consistent with community standards. Can you explain what specific bylaw this violates?" One of the HOA's lawyers stood up. "Your Honor, the HOA board has discretion in determining what is aesthetically appropriate." "Discretion isn't the same as arbitrary authority," Judge Hartley said. "I'm asking for the specific bylaw that prohibits garden gnomes." The lawyer flipped through his papers. Section 12, Paragraph 8 states that all yard decorations must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee. "And did Mrs. Chen submit her gnome for approval?" "No, Your Honor." Judge Hartley turned to the elderly Mrs. Chen. "Did you know you needed approval for a garden gnome?" "No, madam. No one told me that when I bought the house. And I've seen lots of other people with decorations in their yards." "Your Honor," the HOA lawyer interjected, "the requirement for approval is clearly stated in the bylaws that all homeowners receive when they purchase their property." "Let me see a copy of those bylaws." Judge Hartley spent several minutes reading through the thick document. "This is 68 pages long, single-spaced. Are homeowners expected to memorize all of this? They're expected to be familiar with the rules of their community." Judge Hartley did not look amused. She went through several more cases, each one revealing the same pattern: vague bylaws, selective enforcement, and excessive fines. Finally, she addressed the HOA lawyers directly. "Counselors, I'm troubled by what I'm seeing here. This appears to be a systematic abuse of HOA authority for the purpose of generating revenue. That's not what homeowners associations are supposed to do." "Your Honor, the HOA is simply enforcing its bylaws as it's entitled to do under Pennsylvania law. There's a difference between enforcement and harassment." Judge Hartley gathered her papers. "I'm granting the injunction. The Meadowbrook Hills HOA is prohibited from levying any new fines against any homeowner while this case is pending. Furthermore, I'm ordering that all fines collected in the past year be held in escrow pending the outcome of the trial. The HOA is also prohibited from taking any enforcement action, including liens or foreclosure proceedings, until this matter is resolved." Susan looked like she'd been slapped. Her lawyers immediately started whispering to her urgently. The residents in the courtroom broke into applause. "Order!" Judge Hartley banged her gavel. "The trial date is set for January 15th. That gives both sides 3.5 months to prepare. Dismissed." Walking out of the courtroom, I felt like I could breathe for the first time in months. Rachel hugged me, tears in her eyes. "Thank you, thank you, thank you. Don't thank me yet, we still have to win the trial. But this is huge. No more fines, no more harassment, at least for now." Jake clapped me on the shoulder. "You did good, man. But she's right, we still have work to do. The trial is going to be the real battle." That night, I sat on my porch with a beer, my 6 chickens happily settled in their repaired coop, and thought about everything that had happened. All of this because Susan couldn't stand the sight of a few chickens. It would have been funny if it hadn't been so exhausting, but I wasn't naive enough to think it was over. Susan was a true believer in her cause. She genuinely thought she was in the right, that her vision of how the world should be was more important than anyone else's rights or property. People like that didn't give up easily. I was right. 2 weeks after the injunction, someone poisoned my vegetable garden. I came out one morning to find all my tomato plants dead, along with the peppers, squash, and beans. The soil had been doused with something toxic enough to kill everything it touched. This time, the security cameras caught it. At 3 in the morning, a figure in dark clothing and a hood had climbed over my fence and dumped what looked like a large container of herbicide across the garden beds. Officer Martinez came out to review the footage. "Can you identify who this is?" "Not from the video." "Too dark, too much concealment." I replayed the footage. "But look at the walk. That's definitely a woman, and she knew exactly where to find the garden." "We'll investigate, but without a positive ID, it's going to be hard to press charges." The vandalism was reported as part of the lawsuit. Jake added it to our growing list of harassment incidents. "The judge is going to love this," he said sarcastically. I replanted the garden, though it was late in the season. The new security cameras had paid for themselves by catching this on video, even if we couldn't identify the culprit. The footage clearly showed intentional destruction of property, which strengthened our case that someone associated with the HOA was engaging in criminal activity. In November, I got a call from a lawyer I'd never heard of. His name was Robert Chen, and he represented the developer who'd built Meadowbrook Hills. "Mr. Novak, I'd like to meet with you if possible. I think we may have some common interests." We met at a restaurant in Reading. Robert was a sharp-looking guy in his 40s, with a reputation for handling complex real estate cases. "I'll be direct," he said after we ordered. "My client, Riverside Development, is concerned about the lawsuit against the Meadowbrook Hills HOA. When they sold off the homes, they turned over control to the HOA board, but there are provisions in the development agreement that could implicate them if the HOA is found to have engaged in systematic abuse. So you're worried about liability." "Exactly. And here's where it gets interesting. When Riverside was doing the initial surveys for the development, they specifically noted your property and ensured that it would remain independent. They have documentation showing that the HOA board was informed of this multiple times during the transition process." I leaned forward. "Are you saying Susan knew my property wasn't subject to HOA rules all along?" "I'm saying the HOA board was provided with detailed maps and boundary descriptions that made it absolutely clear your farm predated the development and was not part of it." "That's huge." "Can we get those documents for the trial?" Robert smiled. "My client is willing to provide them. They don't want to be dragged into this mess, and the best way to avoid that is to help establish that the HOA acted on its own, against the clear guidance they were given." Jake nearly jumped out of his chair when I told him. "This changes everything. If we can prove Susan knew your property wasn't subject to HOA authority and harassed you anyway, that's not just abuse of power. That's fraud, possibly even extortion." The trial date was approaching fast. December brought cold weather and snow, but the farm stayed busy. I'd started selling Christmas trees from the property, a sideline my dad had run for years. People loved coming out to the farm, picking their own tree and seeing the chickens pecking around in the snow. Susan drove by several times while I was open for business, glaring at the customers and probably making notes about some imaginary violation. But with the injunction in place, there was nothing she could do. On Christmas Eve, I was closing up for the day when an older couple from Meadowbrook Hills stopped by. They bought a tree and then lingered, clearly wanting to talk. "We just wanted to say thank you," the man said. "We're not part of the lawsuit because we were afraid of retaliation, but we're grateful someone is standing up to that woman." His wife nodded. "She's made life miserable for so many people. Our daughter and her husband had to sell their house and move because they couldn't afford the fines anymore." "I'm sorry to hear that." "Don't be sorry. Just win, please." The weight of that responsibility sat heavy on my shoulders as I drove home that evening. This wasn't just about me and my chickens anymore. It was about all those families who'd been bullied and abused by people who thought a little bit of authority made them kings. The new year came, and with it, the final preparations for trial. Jake and Sarah had built a case that was impressive in its thoroughness. They had documentation of over 300 dubious violations, testimony from 48 families, financial records showing the HOA had collected over $400,000 in fines in just 2 years, and expert witnesses on HOA law and property rights. The HOA's lawyers had been trying to settle out of court, but their offers were insulting. They wanted to drop all fines against the plaintiffs in exchange for everyone dropping the lawsuit. No admission of wrongdoing, no changes to HOA practices, no compensation for the stress and financial harm they'd caused. We rejected it. This was going to trial. January 15th arrived cold and clear. The courthouse parking lot was full by 8:30 a.m. The courtroom was packed with residents, lawyers, and media. This case had attracted attention from HOA reform advocates across Pennsylvania and even gotten some national coverage. Judge Hartley took the bench at exactly 9:00 a.m. "This is quite a crowd. Let's maintain order, please. Counselors, are you ready to proceed?" Both sides confirmed they were ready. Sarah gave our opening statement, laying out the case clearly and methodically. The HOA had abused its authority, selectively enforced vague bylaws, collected excessive fines, and engaged in harassment and intimidation. The evidence would show a pattern of behavior that went far beyond legitimate HOA governance. The HOA's lead attorney, a slick-looking guy named Mitchell Bradshaw, gave their opening. He painted the plaintiffs as entitled homeowners who wanted to live in a nice community without following any rules. The HOA was just trying to maintain property values and community standards, and some people were upset about being held accountable. The first witness was Rachel Foster. She testified about the constant violations, the mounting fines, and the fear that had permeated the community. "I was afraid to put up Christmas lights," she said. "Afraid to park my car a certain way. Afraid to have friends over because their cars might be parked wrong. We lived in constant anxiety." Bradshaw cross-examined her aggressively, trying to paint her as someone who just didn't want to follow rules. But Rachel held firm, presenting copies of her violations and the photos showing how minor they actually were. Witness after witness told similar stories. The pattern was undeniable. By the end of the first day, even Bradshaw looked like he knew they were in trouble. The second day focused on financial evidence. Sarah's expert witness, a forensic accountant, testified about the HOA's finances. The fines collected had gone far beyond what was necessary for community maintenance. In fact, while the HOA had collected $400,000 in fines, they'd only spent about $80,000 on actual community improvements. "Where did the rest of the money go?" Sarah asked. "Primarily into the HOA's general fund, where it was used for legal fees, board member stipends, and what appear to be personal expenses. That caused a stir in the courtroom. Bradshaw objected, but the judge allowed the testimony to continue. The accountant detailed trips to conferences in Florida and California, expensive dinners charged to the HOA account, and payments to family members of board members for questionable services. Susan was sweating in her seat. This was not going well for her. On the third day, I testified. Sarah walked me through the entire story, from the first time Susan showed up at my door to the vandalism and harassment I'd experienced. "Mr. Novak, why did you join this lawsuit?" Sarah asked. "Because it wasn't just about me anymore. When I saw what they were doing to those families, how they were using their power to bully people and extract money, I couldn't stand by. My dad taught me that when you see something wrong, you speak up." Bradshaw's cross-examination was predictably hostile. He tried to paint me as someone who wanted to run a commercial farm operation in a residential neighborhood. "Mr. Novak, isn't it true that you sell eggs and produce for profit?" "Yes. It's how I make my living, same as my dad did before me." "And you have customers coming to your property regularly?" "I sell at the farmer's market mostly. Some people do come to the farm, yes." "Doesn't that create traffic and noise that affects your neighbors?" "My neighbors are half a mile away in most directions. And the only neighbors who have ever complained are the HOA board members." Judge Hartley interrupted. "Mr. Bradshaw, Mr. Novak's property rights aren't on trial here. He's not a member of your client's HOA and isn't subject to their authority. Move on." The highlight of the trial came on day 4 when Robert Chen provided the documents from Riverside Development. Sarah introduced them as evidence, and they were devastating. The maps clearly showed my property boundaries and included multiple notes stating that the Novak farm was pre-existing and not subject to HOA authority. There were emails between the developer and the HOA board explicitly explaining this. And there was one email in particular, from Susan herself, acknowledging that my property wasn't part of the HOA but saying they should pursue all available options to bring the property into compliance with community standards. Sarah displayed the email on the courtroom screens. "Miss Patterson, you sent this email to the board on May 3rd, 2 weeks before you first came to Mr. Novak's property. Is that correct?" Susan's lawyer whispered urgently in her ear. On advice of counsel, I declined to answer. "Your Honor, this is a civil trial, not a criminal one. The witness doesn't have Fifth Amendment protections here." Judge Hartley nodded. "Miss Patterson, answer the question." Susan's face was bright red. "Yes, I sent that email." "So you knew that Mr. Novak's property wasn't subject to HOA authority when you first confronted him?" "I believed there might be legal options to challenge that." "But you never told Mr. Novak that, did you? In fact, you told him his property was subject to HOA rules, even though you knew it wasn't." "I was trying to maintain community standards." Sarah pulled up more documents. "And what about these fines you attempted to levy against Mr. Novak? You knew you had no authority to fine him, correct?" "I believed we did." Despite the clear documentation from the developer stating otherwise, Susan had no good answer. The judge had to call a recess because the courtroom was getting too loud with reactions from the audience. The final days of trial focused on the HOA's governance practices overall. Sarah brought in an expert on HOA law who testified that the Meadowbrook Hills Board had violated numerous Pennsylvania statutes regarding HOA governance. The selective enforcement alone is grounds for invalidating most of these fines, the expert said. But combined with the excessive fine amounts, the lack of proper notice, and the evidence of financial mismanagement, this is one of the most egregious cases of HOA abuse I've encountered. Bradshaw tried his best to rehabilitate the HOA's position, but the damage was done. His own witnesses, including Patricia Henderson and Margaret Williams, contradicted each other on key facts and couldn't explain the financial irregularities. On the 8th day of trial, closing arguments were presented. Sarah was brilliant, tying everything together into a narrative of power-hungry individuals who'd used their positions to enrich themselves and punish anyone who challenged them. Bradshaw's closing was defensive and weak. He basically argued that HOAs had broad authority, and even if mistakes were made, they were good faith efforts to maintain the community. Judge Hartley took a full week to review the evidence and write her decision. When we returned to court on January 30th, the tension was palpable. "I've reviewed all the evidence presented in this case," Judge Hartley began, "and I have to say, I'm deeply troubled by what I've seen. Homeowners associations serve an important function in maintaining communities, but they are not above the law. They do not have unlimited authority. And they absolutely cannot use their positions to harass, intimidate, or financially exploit homeowners." She went through the findings point by point. The HOA had engaged in selective enforcement. The fines were excessive and punitive rather than remedial. The bylaws were vague and applied inconsistently. The financial management was questionable at best. As for Mr. Novak specifically, the evidence is clear that the HOA board knew his property was not subject to their authority and harassed him anyway. That goes beyond simple overreach. That's intentional abuse of power. Judge Hartley ordered the HOA to return all fines collected from all plaintiffs over the past 2 years, with interest. She invalidated the current bylaws and ordered the HOA to draft new ones subject to homeowner approval. She removed Susan, Patricia, and Margaret from the board and prohibited them from serving in any HOA leadership position for 5 years. And then came the bombshell. "I'm also referring this matter to the district attorney's office for investigation." The financial irregularities uncovered during this trial suggest possible criminal activity. That's beyond the scope of this civil case, but it warrants criminal investigation. Susan went pale. The courtroom erupted in applause, and this time Judge Hartley didn't stop it. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed us. I gave a brief statement thanking Jake and Sarah and expressing hope that this case would lead to HOA reform. "What about your chickens?" one reporter asked. I smiled. "They're at home doing what chickens do, laying eggs and living their best lives." The criminal investigation moved slowly, as these things do. In March, the district attorney announced charges against Susan and Patricia for fraud and embezzlement. Turns out they'd been siphoning HOA funds into personal accounts for over a year. Margaret cut a deal to testify against them in exchange for probation. She'd known what was happening but had been too afraid of Susan to speak up. The trial took place in June. I attended some of it, curious to see how it would end. The evidence was overwhelming. Susan and Patricia were convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to 18 months in prison and ordered to pay full restitution. As for the farm, life returned to normal. Better than normal, actually. The publicity had brought more customers to my farmer's market stand, and I'd expanded the chicken flock to 12 hens. I'd even started giving tours of the farm to school groups, teaching kids about where their food comes from. The Meadowbrook Hills HOA reformed completely. New board members were elected who actually cared about the community rather than power. The new bylaws were reasonable, clearly written, and focused on genuine community needs rather than petty control. Rachel and her husband became good friends of mine. A lot of the residents who'd been part of the lawsuit would stop by the farm occasionally, just to say hello and see how things were going. One Sunday morning in August, I was out feeding the chickens when a car pulled into my driveway. A young couple got out, looking around with interest. "Is this the famous chicken farm?" the man asked. "I don't know about famous, but this is the Novak farm. Can I help you?" "We're thinking about buying a house in Meadowbrook Hills," the woman said, "but we wanted to meet you first." "After everything that happened, you're kind of a legend around here," I laughed. "I don't know about that, I just wanted to keep my chickens." "Well, those chickens changed a lot of lives," she said. "In a good way." We chatted for a while. They seemed like nice people. They bought a dozen eggs and left with smiles on their faces. I stood on my porch, looking out over the 20 acres of land my dad had bought all those years ago. The farmhouse needed a new coat of paint. The fence by the road needed some repairs. The tractor in the barn was older than I was and would probably need replacing soon, but it was mine. It was home, and no HOA, no matter how determined, was going to change that. The chickens clucked contentedly in their yard, completely unaware that they'd been at the center of a legal battle that had made headlines across Pennsylvania. They didn't care about property rights or bylaws or homeowners associations. They just cared about food, water, and a safe place to lay their eggs. Maybe we could all learn something from that simplicity. I walked back into the farmhouse, poured myself another cup of coffee, and started planning the fall planting. Life was good. The farm was thriving. Justice had been served. And my chickens, those 6 original troublemakers who'd started it all, were happily living their best lives. Sometimes standing your ground is the right thing to do. Sometimes you have to fight for what's yours, even when it's exhausting and expensive and stressful. Because if good people don't stand up to bullies, the bullies win. And I wasn't about to let that happen. Not on my farm, not in my community, not anywhere I could make a difference. The Novak farm had been here since 1982. And if I had anything to say about it, it would be here for another 40 years and beyond. Chickens and all.